By the ancestors, is this strange contraption truly transmitting? If you are receiving this, consider yourselves privileged, or perhaps cursed, to witness the final agonizing breaths of true warrior spirit. You are tuned in to the Edo Echoes, broadcasting live, or more accurately, dying gracefully live, from a very, very confused Japan in the year of our Lord 1868. My name is Master Kenji, a humble samurai torn between duty and change, and if the sheer, impossible audacity of this trans-dimensional broadcast from a moment when our very code of honor clashes with cannon smoke doesn't compel you to immediately smash that subscribe button and commit to understanding true virtue, then, frankly, your soul is already lost to the Western barbarian. Do it now, before my clan's traditional methods of persuasion become obsolete. And tell me, if this peculiar connection holds, from what strange, orderly realm are you listening? What year has the heavenly mandate decreed for you? And what hour do these bewildering tidings reach you? We're taking notes for the afterlife. Now sheathe your swords, they're less effective these days, and let us contemplate the glorious end of an era.
For centuries, Japan was a perfectly polished jewel tucked away from the vulgar outside world. We had strict rules, beautiful art, and very sharp swords. It was quiet, too quiet, perhaps, like the calm before a very loud, very explosive storm. We were truly disciplined then. For more than 200 years, the shogun's word was law, and the law was simple. No one comes in, no one goes out. We were an island in a literal sense, and the shogunate made sure we were an island in every other sense too. The world beyond our shores was a phantom, a story told to scare children, filled with hairy barbarians and their crude machines. We were pure, we were refined, and we were, I admit, magnificently bored. Our society was a perfectly constructed pagoda, each tier in its proper place. At the very top, of course, were us, the samurai. We were the soul of Japan, the guardians of a peace so profound that our primary function became, well, administrative. Below us were the farmers who grew the rice we ate, then the artisans who crafted the swords we no longer used in battle, and at the very bottom were scuttling in the dirt were the merchants. They dealt with money, a filthy business that we nobles pretended to despise while simultaneously spending it on sake and silks. It was a flawless system, provided you didn't mind being stuck in your designated box from the cradle to the grave. If this glimpse into serene isolation is appealing, honor our vast perspective by subscribing now. What was it like to be a warrior with no war? It was a study in controlled frustration. My grandfather fought in the great wars of unification. He told tales of blood and honor. I, on the other hand, spent my days mastering the tea ceremony, composing poetry about the fleeting nature of cherry blossoms, and ensuring official documents were stamped with the correct seal. My katana, a magnificent blade forged by a master, was used mostly for cutting the occasional stray thread from my kimono. We were lions in a cage made of silk and paper, our roars reduced to polite coughs during tedious court meetings. We traded battlefields for bureaucracy and glory for a stable stipend of rice. The peace was our greatest achievement and our most insidious poison. It seeped into the bones of the warrior class, making us soft. We debated points of etiquette with more ferocity than we would ever show an enemy. We mastered the art of the passive-aggressive haiku. The shogunate in Edo demanded absolute loyalty and enforced it with a labyrinth of regulations that would make a demon weep. They feared rebellion, so they kept us occupied with endless, meaningless tasks. They built a nation so stable, so orderly, that it began to creak under the weight of its own perfection, like an old house settling into its foundations, waiting for the one tremor that would bring it all down. Of course, not everything was perfect. How could it be? While we samurai worried about the proper way to view the moon, the merchants were quietly becoming richer than most lords. They financed our lifestyles, lent us money we could never repay, and in doing so, they began to pull the real strings of power. The social order was a beautiful lie we all agreed to believe in. Money, that vulgar Western obsession, was flowing like an underground river, eroding the very ground on which our noble castles stood. We held the swords and the titles, but they held the purse strings, a lamentable and frankly embarrassing state of affairs. And then there were the whispers, stories carried by shipwrecked fishermen or the few Dutch traders confined to their little island prison in Nagasaki. Tales of foreign ships, monstrous things of smoke and steel, moving without sails. They spoke of wars in the great land of China, of empires falling to these outsiders with their explosive cannons and their even more explosive ideas. We scoffed, of course. What could hairy barbarians possibly teach us? Their manners were atrocious, their clothes were absurd, and their souls were surely as black as the smoke their ships belched into the sky. We were content in our jewel box, polishing our swords and our illusions. But the quiet could not last. The silence of our isolation was becoming thin. You could feel it in the air, a tension, a feeling that the perfectly painted screen was about to be kicked in. The world was a vast, roaring ocean, and we had convinced ourselves we could hold it back with paper walls. For 2.5 centuries we succeeded. We lived in a dream of our own making, a land outside of time. We were the last bastion of true civilization in a world gone mad, or so we told ourselves. The truth is, we were a frog at the bottom of a well, content with our patch of sky, unaware of the eagle circling high above. The storm is coming. The world is much larger, much louder, and much, much closer than the Shogun ever wanted us to believe. This broadcast, this voice from a forgotten time, will chronicle the shattering of our perfect world. To bear witness to the end of an era, you must commit your focus now. Strike the subscribe button with the finality of a death blow and ring the bell of notification to ensure you do not miss the coming chaos. Do not be a bystander to history. Join us.
They weren't just ships. They were floating insults, belching black smoke. And they had cannons. Many, many cannons. Turns out, politeness doesn't stop cannonballs. A harsh lesson. Our ancient discipline felt inadequate. The sea had always been our shield, a vast empty moat that kept the grubby world at bay. We watched it for signs, for omens, for the graceful passage of our own fishing boats. Then, in the summer of 1853, the sea betrayed us. It brought forth monsters, 4 of them. They moved against the wind, powered by some infernal heart that coughed out thick black filth into our pristine sky. They were an affront to nature, an offense to the eyes, and they were anchored in our sacred Edo Bay. The official response from the Shogun's men in Edo was a masterclass in flustered panic disguised as stern procedure.
Messengers on swift boats were dispatched, ordering the barbarians to leave at once and proceed to Nagasaki, the only place we allowed foreign pests to fester. The barbarians, in their floating fortresses, effectively laughed. They refused. They said they had a letter for our emperor from their own bearded king, and they would deliver it here, in Edo. The audacity was breathtaking. It was like a wild boar wandering into a tea ceremony and demanding to be served the finest matcha. Our entire system was built on everyone knowing their place, and these men acted as if the pagoda of our society didn't even exist. They began to survey our bay. Little boats filled with men holding strange instruments rowed back and forth, charting the depths, making notes, drawing maps. Our waters, our shores. They measured us. They took our dimensions as a carpenter would measure a block of wood before taking a saw to it. Our samurai watched from the coast, our hands gripping the hilts of our swords. What were we to do? To attack would be to invite annihilation. To do nothing was to swallow a shame so profound it curdled the soul. The shogunate, the great unshakable government that had ruled for centuries, was paralyzed. They issued proclamations, they held meetings, they prayed. The barbarians continued to draw their maps. Then came the noise. To show us their sincerity, they said, to prove their peaceful intentions. The Americans pointed their cannons out to the empty sea and unleashed thunder. It was not the sound of fireworks. It was a physical blow, a concussive force that shook the ground, rattled the windows in the city, and silenced every bird for miles. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated power. It was the sound of a new era, an era where honor and steel were irrelevant. Each blast was a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence we were only just beginning to understand. Your time is over. Some of our archers on the shore loosed arrows in a futile gesture of defiance. They fell into the water, pathetic little twigs against a tidal wave. Don't let our desperate cries for understanding fade. Subscribe for more tales of unwelcome visitors. The pressure was immense. The shogun's council debated in a frantic haze. To refuse the letter was to risk Edo being turned into a smoking crater. To accept it was to admit that our laws, the very foundation of the nation, could be broken by a sufficient application of gunpowder. They chose humiliation over annihilation. They agreed to receive the letter. A special pavilion was hastily constructed on the beach at Kuriyama. It was a stage built for our national dishonor. We were forced to treat these intruders not as pirates, but as legitimate envoys, all because their cannons were bigger than our principles. The day of the meeting felt like a funeral. Their leader, this Commodore Perry, came ashore with a procession, hundreds of them. Marines in strange blue uniforms, carrying rifles with bayonets that gleamed in the sun. They marched with a confidence that bordered on contempt, their boots stamping on sacred ground. Our own samurai retainers, tasked with guarding the ceremony, looked on in stony silence, our brocade silks and lacquered armor suddenly feeling like the costumes for a play that had just been cancelled. We were impeccable relics, perfectly preserved and utterly useless. The letter was delivered. It was housed in a beautiful, ornate box of rosewood and gold, a fine piece of craftsmanship hiding a poison pill. The message itself was simple. Their president wanted friendship, coal for their steamships, and trade. He was asking nicely, but the request was delivered from the mouths of a dozen cannons. The Commodore, a stern man with the eyes of a predator, informed our officials that he would return next year for a favorable answer. He was not asking, he was telling. Then, after this grand performance of intimidation, they simply sailed away, leaving a stunned and fractured nation in their wake. They had lit a fuse and promised to return to watch the explosion. The departure of the black ships did not bring relief. It brought terror. They had left us with an impossible choice and a deadline. The year that followed was one of the most chaotic in our history. The shogunate, in a move of unprecedented weakness, broke with 2.5 centuries of tradition. They circulated the American letter among all the daimyo, the great lords of the realm, and asked for their advice. By asking, they admitted they had no answer. By asking, they shattered the illusion of their own absolute authority. It was like a father admitting to his children that he had no idea how to protect them. The foundation of our world had cracked. Suddenly, everyone had an opinion. The court in Kyoto, long a gilded cage for the divine but powerless emperor, began to stir. Lords who had been silent for generations found their voices, and we samurai, the warrior class, were split down the middle. For centuries our purpose was to uphold the shogun's law. But what if the shogun's law now meant prostrating ourselves before hairy barbarians? Where did our duty lie? With the weak shogun who could not protect the realm, or with the divine emperor and the sanctity of Japan itself? It was a question that would soon be answered with steel. The debate crystallized into a slogan, a roar of defiance that echoed from the castles of zealous lords to the dojos of angry young samurai. Son no joy. Revere the Emperor, expel the barbarian. It was a beautifully simple idea. It was righteous. It was pure. It was also completely insane. The proponents of joy seemed conveniently forget the cannon demonstration. Their solution to the problem of floating fortresses was essentially to charge at them with swords, a wonderfully courageous plan, destined to result in a great many courageous men being turned into a fine red mist. But logic has little power against righteous fury. The joy movement grew like a fever. Samurai who had spent their lives writing poetry suddenly began practicing their swordsmanship with a grim purpose. They saw the shogunate's cautious diplomacy not as pragmatism, but as treason. They assassinated officials they deemed too soft on the foreigners. They dreamed of a great purifying war, a divine wind that would sweep the intruders back into the sea. They were fools, but they were passionate fools, and their passion was a wildfire in the dry fields of our national humiliation. Meanwhile, the shogunate officials, the so-called realists, were trapped. They knew matching the West's military might was impossible. They understood that opening the country was inevitable. They tried to stall, to negotiate, to give away as little as possible. This faction was known as Kaikoku, open the country. They argued that to save Japan, they must learn from the enemy. They had to adopt their technology to one day be able to resist them. To the Joy Samurai, this was the worst kind of heresy. It was like saying to defeat a demon, one must first become a demon. The nation was tearing itself apart from the inside. The year of deliberation was a year of paralysis. While we argued, the world kept moving. The shogunate ordered some half-hearted attempts at building coastal defenses. New forts were constructed from sand and wood. They tried to melt down temple bells to cast new cannons, most of which were more dangerous to their operators than to any potential enemy. It was all a pathetic pantomime of defiance. We were a nation armed with spears, trying to invent firearms while the enemy was already aiming at our head. The ticking clock of the Commodore's promise grew louder with each passing day. And then, as promised, he returned. This time, in February of 1854, he did not bring 4 ships, he brought 8. 8 black monsters, a floating city of death and smoke, arrayed in a battle line at the mouth of Edo Bay. He had doubled his wager. The bluff had been called, and our hand was empty.
Suddenly, everyone wanted to expel the barbarians. A noble sentiment, unless you actually met a barbarian. Then you mostly just wanted to run, or get a better gun. My Bushido felt confused. The phrase was sono joi, and it spread through the land like a fever. Revere the Emperor, expel the Barbarian. It was a masterpiece of political sloganeering, simple enough for an idiot to understand, yet potent enough to tear a country in two. For over 2 centuries, the emperor in Kyoto had been a divine irrelevance, a living god whose only real function was to approve the shogun's decisions and perform ancient rituals. Now, suddenly, he was the symbol of our national purity, a political weapon aimed directly at the heart of the shogunate in Edo. The second half of the slogan, Expel the Barbarian, was the real firestarter. It was a primal scream against the humiliation we had all suffered. It spoke to the warrior who felt his sword was useless, the scholar who saw his culture threatened, and the farmer who saw strange, hairy men walking on sacred soil. It was a call to action that required no complex thought, only passion. The fact that a direct confrontation with the barbarians and their floating castles of death would result in our swift and messy annihilation was a minor detail, conveniently ignored by the movement's most vocal supporters. They were long on righteous fury and desperately short on tactical awareness. This brings us to the shishi, the so-called men of high purpose. In reality, they were mostly young, ambitious, and deeply frustrated lower-ranking samurai who saw the current crisis as a magnificent opportunity. They came primarily from the great western domains, like Choshu and Satsuma, places that had held a grudge against the Tokugawa Shogunate for centuries. They were educated, they were skilled with the sword, and they were convinced that their passion alone could alter the course of history. They romanticized death, writing poems about dying like scattered cherry blossoms for the sake of the emperor. A lovely image, though it did little to stop a cannonball. I watched these young men full of sake and righteous certainty, and I saw a dangerous breed of fool. They confused conviction with correctness. They believed that because their cause was just, their methods must be effective. They spoke of a divine wind that would save Japan, just as it had against the Mongol hordes centuries ago. It seemed to escape them that the Mongol fleet was made of wood and sail, not iron and steam. Their plan, in its entirety, was to charge forward with swords drawn and hope the gods would sort out the details. It was a lamentable strategy, but one they pursued with terrifying commitment. If you're still processing that geopolitical slogan, then you absolutely must subscribe. The imperial court in Kyoto, long a sleepy backwater of poetry and ceremony, transformed overnight into a hotbed of political intrigue. Ambitious court nobles, who had spent their lives mastering calligraphy, suddenly fancied themselves grand strategists. They allied with the radical samurai from the western domains, using the Emperor Komei as their mouthpiece. The emperor, a man who genuinely loathed foreigners with every fiber of his being, was more than happy to issue edicts denouncing the shogunate's treaties and demanding the expulsion of the barbarians. It was a farce. The shogunate's government in Edo was trying to manage a geopolitical crisis while being undermined by holy decrees from a man whose knowledge of the outside world was effectively zero. The first blood was not barbarian blood. It was Japanese. The shishi began a campaign of terror they called Tenchu, or Heaven's Revenge. This was a poetic euphemism for assassinating anyone who disagreed with them.
Their primary targets were officials within the shogunate who had supported the treaties. The assassins would strike in the dead of night, leaving the body of their victim in the street with a note explaining their crime against the nation. It was brutal, effective, and it sent a wave of fear through the political class. To advocate for compromise with the West was to paint a target on your own back. The most traumatic act of Tenchu came in the spring of 1860. Naosuke, the shogun's regent and the man who had pushed the treaties through, was ambushed and assassinated just outside the gates of Edo Castle. It was a snowy day, and his assassins, a band of samurai from Mito and Satsuma, overwhelmed his procession. They cut him down and took his head as a trophy. The symbolism was catastrophic. The shogunate could not even protect its own leader in its own capital city, a stone's throw from the shogun's palace. The message was clear. The shogun's authority was a ghost. No one was safe. With the shogunate reeling, the shishi grew bolder and turned their attention to the source of all their troubles, the foreigners themselves. The newly opened treaty ports like Yokohama became hunting grounds. Translators were cut down. Merchants were ambushed. The British legation was attacked twice. The shishi would strike, kill a foreigner or two, and then melt back into the populace, celebrated as heroes by the anti-foreign factions. They believed each attack was a blow for Japan's honor. In reality, each murder was simply another excuse for the Western powers to bring in more warships and make more demands. These attacks were a study in tragic miscalculation. The shishi operated on a personal code of honor. If a man was dishonored, he would duel his offender. They applied the same concept to international relations. Japan had been dishonored by the treaties. Therefore, they would duel the foreigners by killing them one by one. They failed to grasp that the foreigners did not operate by the code as Bushido. They operated by the code of overwhelming firepower. They did not see these murders as honorable duels. They saw them as barbaric acts that demanded collective and massively disproportionate punishment. The most infamous incident occurred in 1862. The Namamugi Incident, the foreigners called it. A British merchant named Charles Richardson, riding on horseback with 3 companions, failed to dismount and show proper respect to the procession of the daimyo of Satsuma. In our world, this was an insult of the highest order. The samurai in the procession did what they were trained to do. They drew their swords and cut the disrespectful fool down. From their perspective, order was maintained. From the British perspective, one of their citizens had been butchered for a breach of etiquette they didn't even understand. The British response was predictable and utterly devastating. They demanded a huge indemnity from the shogunate and an apology from the Satsuma domain. The shogunate, weak as it was, paid. Satsuma, proud and defiant, refused. So, the following year, a squadron of 7 British warships sailed into Kagoshima Bay, the capital of the Satsuma domain. They intended to intimidate the daimyo into submission. The samurai of Satsuma, brimming with joy fervor, decided this was their moment. They opened fire on the British fleet with their ancient, inadequate cannons. It was the war they had always wanted, and it lasted about 2 days. The British Royal Navy, annoyed at having their negotiations interrupted by cannon fire, proceeded to systematically level the city of Kagoshima. Their modern Armstrong guns fired explosive shells that tore through wooden buildings and set the entire city ablaze. Thousands were left homeless. Satsuma's small, fledgling navy was sunk. Their prized cannon foundry was destroyed. The samurai fought bravely, of course. They always do. But bravery is no defense against raining explosives. The lesson was brutal and clear. Expel the Barbarian was not a viable foreign policy. You would think the other domains would have learned from Satsuma's fiery lesson. You would be wrong. The domain of Choshu, even more radical and zealous, decided it was their turn to show everyone how to properly expel a barbarian. Acting on the emperor's now famous edict, Choshu's military forces decided to close the straits of Shimonoseki, a vital international shipping.
The emperor, a living god, but mostly for ceremonial flower arranging. Now, suddenly, he's the rallying cry for a civil war. He seems just as surprised as we are. Another change, more chaos. For more than 2.5 centuries, the emperor was the nation's most revered and politically impotent figure. He was the sun, a source of light and warmth, but from a very, very great distance. The shogun in Edo was the earth, the solid ground of military power and administration upon which we all stood. The emperor lived in a gilded cage in Kyoto, a world of sublime poetry, ancient ritual, and complete political irrelevance. His divine duty was to ensure the seasons changed on time, and to lend his holy authority to the man with the biggest army, that being the shogun. This comfortable arrangement worked perfectly. The shogunate ran the country, and the emperor ran the calendar. It was a tidy division of labor that kept the peace. The emperor was a symbol, a link to our divine origins, but a symbol is meant to be admired, not consulted. His opinions on matters of state were neither sought nor welcomed. The shogun would send him lavish gifts, speak of him with the utmost reverence, and then proceed to do exactly as he pleased. The imperial court was a beautiful, fossilized relic, and everyone understood its purpose was to be seen and not heard. Then the black ships came, and suddenly everyone remembered that our most beautiful relic was also technically our legitimate head of state. The first crack in this ancient system was the previous emperor, Komei. Unlike his ancestors, Komei had strong opinions. Specifically, he had one very strong opinion. He despised foreigners. He loathed them with a passion that was as pure as it was impractical. This made him the perfect figurehead for the Sonno-jōi movement. The rebellious lords of the West, particularly from the Choshu domain, saw their opportunity. They began to whisper in the ear of the emperor, stoking his xenophobia, and for the first time in centuries, the court in Kyoto began issuing decrees that directly contradicted the shogun's policies. The divine puppet had begun to twitch with a life of its own. This created an impossible situation for the shogunate. How do you defy the will of a living god? The shogun's men had spent generations lecturing everyone on the importance of revering the emperor, and now that reverence was being used as a weapon against them. The rebels would wave the emperor's anti-foreign proclamations in the shogun's face, branding him a traitor for failing to carry out the divine will. It was a brilliant political maneuver. The Revere the Emperor part of their famous slogan was now in full effect, and it was proving to be just as destructive as a cannonball. Support our return to divine authority. Hit that subscribe button before the next political earthquake. But Emperor Komei, for all his symbolic usefulness, eventually became a problem for the very rebels who had elevated him. Their own disastrous encounters with Western firepower at Kagoshima and Shimonoseki had taught them a harsh lesson. The Expel the Barbarian part of their slogan was national suicide. They had secretly pivoted to a new strategy: learn from the West, adopt its technology, and then overthrow the shogunate. The only issue was their figurehead. Emperor Komei still genuinely believed in expelling the barbarians. He was a true believer in a cause his own champions now knew was a fantasy. It is always inconvenient when your symbol develops a mind of its own. The ambitious lords of Satsuma and Choshu, who were now secretly plotting together, needed a new face for their revolution. They needed a leader who would sanctify their embrace of Western methods, not condemn it. Emperor Komei, with his rigid, old-fashioned hatred of all things foreign, was now an obstacle to the very movement he had inspired. He represented the past, and their future was of rifles, ironclads, and political pragmatism. He was a symbol of a policy that had already failed spectacularly in a hail of explosive shells. Then, in the early days of 1867, a miracle occurred, depending on your perspective. Emperor Komei, a healthy man of 35, suddenly contracted smallpox and died. The official story was that he succumbed to the disease, a common enough tragedy, but the timing was, to put it mildly, remarkable. The one man standing in the way of a full-scale, modernized rebellion against the shogun was suddenly and permanently removed from the board. Whispers of poison slithered through the corridors of the court, but no one could prove a thing. He was cured of his troublesome opinions by a sudden and fatal case of being politically inconvenient. With Komei gone, the chrysanthemum throne passed to his son, Crown Prince Mutsuhito, a boy of 14. He would become known to history as the Emperor Meiji, and he was everything the rebels could have hoped for. He was a child, raised entirely within the cloistered, feminine, and deeply superstitious confines of the imperial palace. He had never seen a foreigner, a steamship, or even a city outside of Kyoto. He was a blank slate, a perfect, unblemished symbol of a new beginning. He was young, malleable, and possessed the one thing the rebels needed above all else: divine authority. The leaders of the Satsuma-Choshu alliance, men like Saigo Takamori and Okubo Toshimichi, wasted no time. They moved to consolidate their influence over the young emperor, effectively seizing control of the imperial court. They surrounded the boy with their own loyalists, filtering his information, guiding his education, and shaping his worldview. It was a coup in all but name, a quiet kidnapping of a god. The emperor was being restored to power, but it was a power that would be wielded by the ambitious lords who now held his seal and spoke on his behalf. The boy emperor became the silent, sacred centerpiece of their revolution. Every proclamation demanding the overthrow of the shogun would now be issued in his name. Every call to arms would be a holy command. They were no longer mere rebels, they were imperial loyalists, fighting to restore the rightful ruler of Japan. It was a political rebranding of staggering genius. How could the shogun's forces fight against an army that claimed to be the emperor's own? To raise a sword against them would be to raise a sword against the heavens. Meanwhile, the last shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, was a sharp and capable man. He was no fool. He could see the storm gathering. He knew that the Satsuma-Choshu alliance, or the Sacho alliance as we started calling them, was using the young emperor to corner him. He knew they were preparing for war, a war they would frame as a righteous crusade. So he attempted to outmaneuver them by making a shocking move in the autumn of 1867. He voluntarily resigned his position as shogun. It was a brilliant gamble.
Yoshinobu formally returned governing authority to the emperor, effectively dissolving the shogunate that had ruled Japan for over 250 years. His plan was to preempt the rebels' war. He hoped to establish a new council of great lords with the emperor at the head to govern the nation. In such a council, he, as the leader of the vast Tokugawa clan, would still hold immense power, perhaps even the most power as a sort of prime minister. He tried to defuse the bomb by dismantling it himself. He surrendered his title to save his power. The Sacho rebels were horrified. A peaceful transition that left the Tokugawa clan with any influence whatsoever was their worst-case scenario. Their entire goal was not just to restore the emperor, but to utterly destroy the Tokugawa. They had spent years plotting, assassinating, and preparing for a war to seize complete control, and now Yoshinobu was trying to steal their victory with a peaceful resignation. They could not allow it. Their revolution needed a villain, and Yoshinobu had just tried to walk off the stage. So they forced the issue. On the 3rd of January 1868, Satsuma and Shoshu troops stormed the gates of the imperial palace in Kyoto. They sealed off the grounds, isolating the young emperor and cutting off access for any pro-Tokugawa nobles. With the palace secured, they had the boy emperor issue the fateful Imperial Restoration Edict. This proclamation went much further than simply accept.
My katana, forged for generations, can cleave steel. A single foreign bullet, however, can cleave a samurai. It's terribly unfair and very, very loud. Our ancient discipline is adapting, slowly, painfully. For centuries, the sound of war was the sound of men. It was the war cry, the scream of the charge, the rhythmic clang of steel on steel, a brutal but intimate symphony. A battle was a collection of duels, a test of a man's courage, his skill, his spirit. You looked your enemy in the eye. You saw the spirit, the key that drove him. Now the sound of war is the sound of a factory. It is the deafening, impersonal bark of the rifle, the thunderous roar of the cannon, a mechanical, soulless noise that drowns out all courage and honor. This new warfare is a vulgar business. There is no artistry in it. A master of the sword dedicates his entire existence to achieving a single, perfect cut. He trains from childhood, hardening his body and soul, learning to move with the grace of a striking serpent. A peasant with a new breech-loading rifle, on the other hand, dedicates perhaps an afternoon to learning how to load a cartridge and pull a trigger. The results of their respective efforts, lamentably, are often the same. The master swordsman lies dead in the mud, his perfect form ruined by a clumsy piece of lead fired by a man who cannot even write his own name. It is the height of inefficiency and an insult to aesthetics. The firearm is the great leveler, the ultimate destroyer of the beautiful, orderly pyramid of our society. On the battlefield, it erases class, lineage, and skill. A lifetime of martial discipline, a bloodline stretching back to the heroes of the Genpei War, a magnificent suit of armor passed down for generations. All of it is rendered meaningless by a commoner with a steady hand and a good rifle. I have seen it myself. I have seen men who were legends, men whose names mothers used to quiet their children, fall to a random shot from a distant tree line, killed by someone they never saw for reasons they would never understand.
The most humiliating part is that we have known of these weapons for centuries. The Portuguese barbarians brought us the first matchlocks 300 years ago. We called them Tanegashima, and for a time they changed our wars. But they were clumsy, slow-loading, inaccurate things. During the Great Peace of the Tokugawa, the sword was elevated back to its rightful place as the true weapon of the samurai, and the gun became little more than a tool for foot soldiers. We put the genie back in the bottle, or so we thought. We were fools. The guns the foreigners brought back with them were not the same toys. Help us understand these perplexing new weapons. Subscribe now. The new rifles were a different species of beast altogether. They were not slow-burning matchlocks. They were percussion rifles, breech loaders, the Prussian Dries needle gun, the French chassepot, the American Spencer repeating rifle. These weapons could be loaded from the rear, even while lying down. They could be fired multiple times a minute, in any weather. They were accurate over distances that rendered our archers obsolete. And then there was the Gatling gun, a hand-cranked monstrosity that could spit a continuous stream of fire, mowing down charging men like a farmer scything wheat. It was not a weapon. It was a plague. Suddenly, every ambitious daimyo was desperate to acquire these new tools of death. A frantic arms race began. Foreign merchants, who once had to beg for access at the tiny port of Dejima, now found themselves the most popular men in Japan. Smooth-talking salesmen from Britain, France, and America set up shop, happy to sell the latest military hardware to anyone with enough gold, regardless of which side they were on. The shogunate bought guns. The imperial rebels bought guns. Sometimes they bought them from the same man on the same day. Our civil war was becoming a spectacular business opportunity for the very people we had once wanted to expel. The shogunate, for all its talk of tradition, was not entirely stupid. It saw the writing on the wall. Under French military advisors, they established new, modern infantry corps. The most formidable of these was the Denshutai, an elite brigade armed with advanced French rifles and trained in European tactics. They marched in disciplined ranks, wore practical Western-style uniforms, and fought with chilling efficiency. We traditional samurai looked upon them with a mixture of fear and contempt. They were powerful, yes, but they had sacrificed their souls. They had traded their kimonos and katana for foreign clothes and foreign methods. They looked like an army of occupation, not the army of the shogun. The imperial forces, particularly those from Choshu, were even more radical. Years earlier, the brilliant and reckless Takasugi Shinsaku had created the Kiheitai, the irregular unit. This militia shattered the sacred principle that only samurai were allowed to fight. It was composed of samurai, farmers, merchants, and even priests, all drilled as a modern infantry unit. They were motivated, well-equipped, and fiercely loyal to the imperial cause. The creation of the Kiheitai was the beginning of the end for the samurai's monopoly on violence. It proved that a peasant with a rifle and a cause could be just as deadly as any nobleman. A deeply unsettling thought. The Boshin War, when it finally began in earnest in 1868, became a series of brutal lessons in this new reality. The opening battle at Toba Fujimi, just south of Kyoto, set the tone for the entire conflict. The forces loyal to the shogunate, though greater in number, were a disorganized mix of traditional samurai retainers and modernized units.
Many of them marched into battle as their ancestors had, with swords, spears, and a glorious belief in the power of a head-on charge. They were magnificent, they were brave, and they were slaughtered. The imperial forces of Satsuma and Shoshu had taken up defensive positions. They were outnumbered, but they were better organized and better armed. They had cannons, they had Gatling guns, they had ranks of riflemen who had been drilled to fire in disciplined volleys. As the shogunate samurai charged forward, a brilliant wave of color and steel, the imperial lines simply waited. They waited until the charging ranks were close enough to not miss. Then they unleashed a wall of fire and lead. It was not a battle. It was an industrial process of annihilation. The glorious charge dissolved into a writhing heap of the dead and dying. The psychological impact of this was profound. Imagine dedicating your entire life to mastering the way of the sword, believing in your heart that your courage and skill make you invincible. Imagine charging an enemy, your war cry on your lips, only to see your comrades vaporized by a cannonball or dropped in twitching heaps by an enemy you cannot even see clearly. The courage does not fail, but the body does. The spirit remains willing, but the flesh is torn apart by an invisible force. It breeds a unique kind of terror, a feeling of utter helplessness that rots the soul. We learned quickly that armor, our beautiful, intricate armor, was worse than useless. It offered no protection from a bullet, which could punch through the finest lacquered steel as if it were paper. In fact, the armor simply made you a bigger, slower target. It was better to be nimble and use cover than to trust in the craftsmanship of your ancestors. We began to see samurai shedding their armor, fighting in simple clothing, looking more like bandits than warriors. The symbols of our status had become liabilities. The katana itself, the soul of the samurai, faced its own existential crisis. What is the purpose of the soul when the body it inhabits can be so easily destroyed from 100 paces away? The sword is a weapon of proximity, of personal combat. The rifle is a weapon of distance and anonymity. The war became a desperate struggle to close that.
Honor dictates one charges bravely. Modern weaponry dictates one ducks. My Bushido manual needs a serious update. It's less about dying gloriously and more about surviving long enough to be utterly bewildered. The way of the warrior, Bushido, was meant to be our bedrock, a foundation of virtue in a chaotic world. It taught us loyalty, courage, compassion, and honor. For generations, it was a clear and simple guide to a righteous life. Now that bedrock has been turned to quicksand. The world has changed so fast that our ancient code of conduct has become a handbook for magnificent failure. Let us start with loyalty, the cornerstone of our code. A samurai's loyalty to his lord is meant to be absolute, unshakable, more important than life itself. A simple enough principle when there was one shogun, one master of the realm. But who is the rightful lord now? Is it the shogun, whose family has commanded our allegiance for 250 years, but who failed to protect the nation from the barbarians? Or is it the emperor, a divine child in Kyoto, whose authority is being wielded by ambitious Western lords who preach rebellion? Our loyalties are being torn in two. I have seen it with my own eyes. Men who grew up together, who swore oaths of brotherhood, now stand on opposite sides of the battlefield. One wears the banner of the shogun, the other the brocade of the emperor.
They charge each other with murder in their hearts, each utterly convinced of his own righteousness, each branding the other a traitor. Bushido commands loyalty, but when the very definition of legitimate authority is up for debate, the code simply provides a justification for killing your friends. It has become a catalyst for tragedy, a moral compass spinning wildly in a hurricane. Then there is courage. We are taught to embrace death, to fear dishonor more than the grave. A glorious death in battle is the highest aspiration of the warrior. This is a fine philosophy when facing swords and spears. It is somewhat less practical when facing a Gatling gun. To charge headlong into a hail of bullets is not courage. It is a form of agricultural thinning. Our ancestors would see a man taking cover behind a rock as a coward. We are beginning to see him as a veteran. The line between bravery and stupidity has become dangerously blurred. If you're finding this moral quandary fascinating, smash that subscribe button now. The very nature of heroism has been poisoned. A hero in the old tales is a man who overcomes a great foe through superior skill and indomitable spirit. What is a hero now? Is it the man who operates the cannon that obliterates an entire platoon from a mile away? He has shown no personal courage, risked nothing. Is it the general who buys 1,000 more rifles than his opponent? His victory is one of logistics and finance, not of martial prowess. This new warfare celebrates the technician and the quartermaster, not the warrior. It is a victory of mathematics over spirit, and it feels deeply, profoundly dishonorable. And what of compassion, the virtue of the truly strong? Bushido teaches that one must be benevolent, to show mercy to a defeated enemy. This is a noble sentiment. I would ask my ancestors, how does one show compassion to a cannon? How do you grant mercy to a rifle bullet? This impersonal warfare makes such virtues seem quaint. We are not fighting men anymore. We are fighting a machine, and the machine has no honor to appeal to, no capacity for mercy. It only has an insatiable appetite for lives. The code dictates that a samurai should be righteous and just in his actions. But this war is a messy, ugly affair. To win, we must resort to tactics that would have shamed our grandfathers. We practice the art of the ambush, striking from the shadows like common bandits. We engage in deception and espionage. The imperial armies have gone even further, filling their ranks with armed peasants, shattering the samurai's exclusive right to bear arms. To achieve the righteous goal of restoring the emperor, they have trampled upon the very social order they claim to be protecting. Victory, it seems, is only possible through dishonorable means. Perhaps the most bitter pill to swallow is the newfound importance of money. The samurai code has always held commerce in contempt. A warrior should be concerned with honor and duty, not with gold and silver. We look down upon the merchant class as parasites. Now we must go to these same merchants, cap in hand, to beg for the funds to buy more guns, more ammunition. The success of a military campaign now depends less on the bravery of its soldiers and more on the depth of its coffers. The fate of the nation is being decided by men who have never held a sword, and it is a humiliation beyond words. The power has shifted. The abacus has proven mightier than the sword. I have seen proud samurai lords, men who could trace their lineage to the gods, forced to bow to chubby merchants whose only skill is calculation. The merchant finances the war, the foreigner supplies the weapons, and the samurai provides the corpses. It is a new and deeply unsettling social order, one not found in any of our texts. Our contempt for money has not protected us from its power.
It has only made us its slaves. Even the final, most personal expression of our code, seppuku, has lost its meaning. Ritual suicide was our way of taking responsibility, of preserving one's honor in the face of failure or protesting a grave injustice. It was a samurai's ultimate right. But in this age of universal failure and endless injustice, what is its purpose? If every samurai whose lord made a foolish decision or whose cause was lost were to commit seppuku, the land would be empty. It has become a hollow gesture. Why die on your own sword when a stray bullet will so graciously do the job for you with much less ceremony? The strain of these contradictions is breaking us. I see it in the eyes of my comrades. There is a deep weariness, a spiritual exhaustion that no amount of sleep can cure. Some have simply snapped. They have become ruthless killers, embracing the chaos and abandoning all pretense of the code. They are no longer samurai. They are just men with guns who have forgotten why they are fighting. They are the hollow men, their Bushido replaced by a cold, nihilistic fury. They are terrifying, and I fear they are the future. Others have chosen a different path of escape. They cling to the old ways with a fanatic's desperation. They refuse to use rifles, polish their swords obsessively, and recite the old codes as if the words themselves had the power to stop bullets. They charge into battle with beautiful, suicidal grace, and they die. They die for their principles, which is admirable, but their principles are dead, and so their deaths achieve nothing. They are martyrs for a faith that has already lost its God. Then there are those, and I suspect there are many of us, who are simply lost. We stand in the middle, paralyzed by the contradictions. We use the new weapons because we must, but we feel shame with every trigger pull. We follow our lords because loyalty demands it, but we no longer believe in their cause. We fight because it is all we have ever known, but we have forgotten what victory is supposed to feel like. We are ghosts, haunting the ruins of our own moral code. I had a friend, Oishi-san. We trained in the same dojo. He was a traditionalist, a man who believed in the sword with all his heart. When our Lord ordered our unit to be re-equipped with rifles, he refused. He called it a barbarian's tool. He was given a choice, adapt or be dismissed. He chose dismissal. He became a ronin, a masterless samurai. I saw him a few months later, working as a hired guard for a rice merchant. His eyes were empty. The dishonor of his new life had killed his spirit long before his body would die. Another friend, Tanaka, went the other way. He embraced the rifle with a terrifying zeal. He became one of the best marksmen in our company. He cut off his topknot, adopted a Western hairstyle, and now speaks of tactics and firing arcs. He is an effective soldier. He is also a complete stranger to me now. The man I once knew, who loved poetry and the tea ceremony, is gone. In his place is a cold, efficient killing machine. He survived, but I am...
We're fighting our own countrymen now, some with swords, some with rifles. It's like a very disorganized, very deadly costume party. Everyone's confused. Our ancient discipline tells us to fight, but against whom exactly? The year 1868 began not with the traditional ceremonies of peace and renewal, but with the tramp of marching feet. The slow, agonizing collapse of our nation had finally given way to the sharp, clarifying brutality of open war. It was the year of the dragon, the Boshin War, a rather poetic name for a conflict that was mostly about which side had better artillery. The first act of this tragedy unfolded near Kyoto. The former shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, having been tricked and outlawed by the court coup, was pressured by his vassals to act.
They were furious, humiliated, and spoiling for a fight. They convinced him to march his army from Osaka towards Kyoto under the noble pretext of rescuing the young emperor from the evil counsel of the Satsuma and Choshu lords. Both sides now claimed to be fighting for the emperor, a political situation that made my head ache. The emperor, in effect, was now at war with himself, and we were the poor fools tasked with resolving his internal conflict with our blood. The armies that met at the southern approaches to Kyoto at Toba and Fushimi were a perfect illustration of our confused and fractured nation. The shogunate army was a magnificent mess. It was larger, a great wave of men, but it was a chaotic jumble of eras. There were proud samurai retainers in full glorious suits of ancestral armor, carrying spears and swords. Marching alongside them were modernized infantry units in French uniforms, carrying French rifles. It was an army at war with its own identity, a clash of old and new before a single shot was even fired. The imperial army, by contrast, was smaller, but it was lean, modern, and disciplined. The men of Satsuma and Choshu had learned their brutal lessons from the British and their combined fleet. They had abandoned the romantic folly of the glorious charge. They dug in, took up defensive positions, and calmly sighted their superior Armstrong cannons and breech-loading rifles. It was an army of the future, facing an army that was still half stuck in the past. The result was as predictable as it was tragic. Don't let our tragic civil war fade. Hit that subscribe button. The battle was a cacophony of madness. Shogunate samurai, fueled by centuries of pride, charged forward with all the courage and spirit their code demanded. They were met not by an opposing charge, but by a methodical, industrial slaughter. Disciplined volleys of rifle fire tore through their ranks. Cannon shells exploded overhead, sending shrapnel through men and horses alike. A warrior in a fearsome demon-faced helmet would be dropped from 100 paces by a farmer in a simple cone-shaped hat. It was a duel between gallantry and gunpowder, and gallantry never stood a chance. The defining moment came on the second day. The imperial forces, having confirmed the shogunate's men were indeed attacking them, unfurled a sacred weapon, the imperial brocade banner. It was a flag of red and gold, last seen on a battlefield centuries ago, personally given to the imperial commander by the emperor himself. By raising this banner, they transformed the skirmish. It was no longer a battle between rival feudal lords. The shogunate army was now officially, undeniably, firing upon the symbol of the emperor himself. They were traitors to the throne. The psychological impact was devastating. Many of the daimyo leading the shogunate's forces had joined the march believing they were acting as loyalists. When they saw that golden banner fluttering in the winter wind, their resolve crumbled. One moment you are a patriot marching to correct an injustice. The next you are an enemy of the divine. Clans began to switch sides. Units laid down their arms and refused to fight. The shogunate's great army dissolved in a state of moral confusion. It's hard to maintain a battle line when your own justification has deserted you. In the midst of this chaos, Yoshinobu, the former shogun, lost his nerve. He abandoned his army, fleeing by ship from Osaka to his capital city of Edo. With their leader gone and their cause branded as treasonous, the remaining shogunate forces at Toba Fushimi collapsed. The first and arguably most decisive battle of the Boshin War was over. The path to Edo was now open for the imperial army. The war was far from over, but the shogunate had suffered a blow from which it would never recover. The imperial army marched east, and the great city of Edo, the military capital of Japan for over 2 centuries, held its breath. The commander of the imperial forces, the formidable Saigo Takamori of Satsuma, prepared for an all-out assault. It would have been a bloodbath, a firestorm that would have consumed the city. But the war took another strange turn. The shogunate's top army minister, a pragmatic man named Katsu Kaishu, met with Saigo and negotiated the peaceful surrender of Edo Castle. There was no grand final battle for the capital. The heart of Tokugawa power was handed over without a fight, to spare the lives of 1 million citizens. It was a deeply sensible and profoundly anticlimactic moment. But the surrender of Edo did not mean the surrender of all who were loyal to the Tokugawa. The war simply flowed north. The most stalwart of the shogunate's vassals, particularly the proud samurai of the Aizu domain, refused to bow to what they saw as an illegitimate government run by their traditional enemies, Satsuma and Choshu. They formed a coalition, the Northern Alliance, and vowed to fight on. From their perspective, they were the true loyalists, fighting to defend the old ways from a band of opportunist rebels who had hijacked the emperor. The war in the north was a grinding, brutal affair. It was a war of sieges and attrition, fought in the mountains and rice paddies of Tohoku. Here the clash between the old and new was even more stark. The imperial army, flushed with victory and supplied with an endless stream of modern weapons, pushed relentlessly northward. The Northern Alliance fought back with a fierce, desperate courage, their armies a patchwork of riflemen and spearmen, their tactics a confused blend of modern defense and suicidal samurai charges. The heart of the resistance was the Aizu domain, a land renowned for its martial prowess and unbending loyalty to the Tokugawa clan. The siege of their town of Aizu Rakamatsu became the stuff of legend, a symbol of the tragic heroism of the losing side. The samurai of Aizu, men, women, and even children, fought with a ferocity that stunned the imperial commanders. They knew they were doomed, but they were determined to die honorably, according to the code that had governed their lives. One of the most heart-wrenching stories to emerge from that siege was that of the Byakutu Force, the White Tiger Force. This was a reserve unit made up of teenage boys, the sons of Aizu samurai, aged 16 to 17. During a desperate fight, a group of these boys was cut off from the main force. From a nearby hill, they saw smoke rising from the castle town and believed their castle had fallen. In despair, following the strict code of their class, they committed ritual suicide, seppuku, rather than face the dishonor of capture. The castle had not fallen. They had died for a mistake. It was a moment of pure, wasteful tragedy that encapsulated the fanaticism and folly of the war. Despite their incredible bravery, Aizu could not hold out forever. After a month of brutal siege, with their town in ruins and their forces decimated, the castle finally surrendered. The fall of Aizu broke the back of the Northern Alliance. The war on the main island of Honshu was effectively over. The imperial forces, or rather the government of the new Emperor Meiji, had consolidated its control. But a remnant of the resistance refused to give up. Led by the shogunate's naval admiral Enomoto Takeaki, a fleet carrying the last of the loyalist troops and a handful of their French military advisors escaped the mainland. They sailed north to the untamed, sparsely populated island of Eizo, now known as Hokkaido. Here, in the winter of 1868, they did something truly bizarre. They declared the founding of the Republic of Eizo, and in a democratic election, they voted Enomoto to be their first president. It was the first and only republic ever established on Japanese soil.
So, a Frenchman taught us how to point a noisy stick, and an Englishman taught the other side. Very helpful. They probably thought it was quaint. Our ancient discipline felt mocked. The Boshin War, a conflict born from a furious desire to expel the foreign barbarian from our sacred shores, was now being managed by them. The supreme irony seemed to be lost on our leaders, who in a state of profound panic decided the best way to fight a war about Japanese purity was to hire outsiders to show us how to do it. It was a strategy so drenched in contradiction it made my liver ache. This was not a subtle affair. This was a formal arrangement. The shogunate, in a desperate attempt to catch up with the modern world, had invited a French military mission to Japan in 1867. Their task was to take our army, a beautiful but archaic collection of feudal levies, and transform it into a modern fighting force capable of standing up to a Western power. Of course, they arrived just in time for us to turn those new skills not on the West, but on ourselves. The timing was, as with everything in this era, impeccably tragic. And so we met the Frenchmen. They were a strange species. They walked with an unearned confidence, smelled of wine and strange perfumes, and sported moustaches of such magnificent, aggressive curl that they seemed to be a separate life form clinging to their upper lips. They spoke in a rapid nasal tongue that sounded like a cat complaining, and they were obsessed with marching in straight lines. Our battlefields are covered with hills, trees, and rocks. The French solution to this was apparently to pretend the hills, trees, and rocks were not there, and to be very disappointed in us when we failed to march through them. Their leader was a Captain Chanoine, and later the artistically inclined Captain Jules Brunet. They and their team of officers set about teaching us the European way of war. This mostly involved standing in a field for hours under the hot sun while they shouted things like un, deux, trois. We, the inheritors of a martial tradition stretching back 1,000 years, men who could read the subtle shift in an opponent's breathing, were now being taught to stare at the back of the man in front of us and wait for a foreigner to scream fur. It was a deeply humbling experience, and I do not mean that in a good way. If you're still listening and not dodging foreign consultants, subscribe to our channel. Meanwhile, the imperial side, the rebels from Satsuma and Choshu, were receiving their own foreign assistance, albeit in a more clandestine, typically British fashion. Officially, Great Britain was neutral in our little domestic squabble. Unofficially, they saw the energetic, modernizing rebels as a much better long-term investment than the crumbling, sclerotic shogunate. British diplomats offered quiet encouragement, and British merchants, like the infamous Thomas Glover in Nagasaki, grew fabulously wealthy selling the rebels the very best Armstrong cannons, Enfield rifles, and modern steamships. While the French were setting up a formal military school for us, the British were providing a more practical education for our enemies. Royal Navy officers would coincidentally be available to offer informal advice on naval gunnery. British engineers would happen to be on hand to explain the finer points of their new steam engines. The French were honest and open in their meddling, setting up a classroom on the battlefield. The British preferred to slip our enemies the answers to the test while pretending to be admiring the garden. Both methods were, unfortunately, quite effective. The clash of cultures during our French-led training sessions was a constant source of grim amusement. The French instructors would try to teach us about strategic withdrawal and falling back to a defensive position. We, who had been taught that retreat was the deepest shame a warrior could endure, found this concept baffling. You want us to run away?
On purpose? It was madness. Our solution to a losing battle was to charge harder and die more gloriously. Theirs was to live to fight another day. It was a fundamental disagreement on the entire purpose of warfare. They were equally horrified by our traditions. I recall a French lieutenant attempting to understand the concept of seppuku. "So," he said through a translator, "when you have failed, you cut open your own stomach." "Yes," we explained. "But why? Who gives the order?" "No one," we said. "You give it to yourself." He simply stared at us, his magnificent mustache twitching in disbelief. His solution to failure was to find someone else to blame and write a lengthy self-aggrandizing report. Our way seemed terribly inefficient to him. Despite the cultural chasm, the French training did have an effect. We learned to fire in volleys, to coordinate artillery, to build European-style fortifications. The shogun's elite Denshutai Corps, trained and equipped by the French, became a formidable fighting force. They were a testament to what could be achieved. They were also a group of men who no longer looked or acted like samurai. They had traded their heritage for efficiency, and many of us old warriors looked at them with a mixture of awe and disgust. They were our best soldiers, and they were a betrayal of everything we stood for. The war then became a surreal proxy conflict fought on our own soil. It was the shogunate's French-trained army versus the imperial's British-supplied army. We were fighting for the future of Japan, but the fight was being conducted using foreign tools, according to foreign rulebooks, with foreign consultants cheering from the sidelines. It strips a bit of the glory from a conflict when you realize your heroic charge was planned by a man named Jean-Pierre. The most curious case was that of Captain Brunet himself. When the Boshin War began in earnest, and the French government, under the pressure of the increasingly victorious imperial side, officially declared neutrality and ordered its military mission to go home, Brunet faced a choice. He could obey his government, pack his bags and return to a comfortable career in France, or he could stay. He chose to stay. He resigned from the French army and pledged his loyalty to the last remnants of the shogunate's forces, led by Admiral Enomoto. This Frenchman, this advisor we had often mocked, decided to cast his lot with us, the losing side. He traveled north with Enomoto's fleet to the new Republic of Ezo in Hokkaido. There, in that strange, doomed republic of samurai rebels, this French artillery officer became a de facto minister of war. He helped organize the defenses of Hakodate, using his engineering skills to strengthen the Goryokaku fortress. He fought alongside samurai in the final desperate battles. What were we to make of this? Was it loyalty? A sense of honor? Or was it simply the romantic foolishness of an adventurer who had gotten caught up in a story grander than his own? With foreigners, it is often difficult to tell the difference. But I will admit this. In the end, Captain Jules Brunet displayed a loyalty to his comrades that many Japanese samurai, who had switched sides to join the victors, could not match. This Frenchman, this advisor we had often mocked, turned out to have a bit of Bushido in him, after all. His presence, and that of the other French officers who stayed with him, created one of history's most bizarre military units. A handful of Frenchmen, in their worn-out European uniforms, fighting alongside samurai in full armor, defending a Japanese republic against the armies of the Japanese Emperor. It was the final surreal chapter of a deeply surreal war. A war that started about expelling all foreigners, ended with a Frenchman becoming a hero of the last samurai resistance. Of course, their expertise could only delay the inevitable. The imperial army was too large, too well equipped. The Republic of Ezo fell. Brunei was eventually turned over to a French warship and sent back to France, where he was punished lightly and went on to have a distinguished career. His Japanese comrades were not so lucky. They were killed or imprisoned, their cause utterly defeated. The uninvited Sensei got to go home. The students had to live in the ruins he had helped create. Looking back, the rule of these foreign advisors was deeply insidious. They did not come here to help Japan. They came here to advance the interests of their own nations. France backed the shogunate, hoping to gain a powerful ally and economic partner. Britain backed the Satcho rebels for the exact same reason. Our civil war was in part a chess match between two European powers, and we were the board. They provided the tools.
The farmers, bless their rice-growing hearts, now have rifles, and they're surprisingly good at using them. My ancestors are spinning in their graves, probably very fast. The old order, our discipline, unravels. For centuries the world was a simple, elegant construction. At the top there were us, the samurai. We were the roof, the swords, the protectors of the realm. Below us were the farmers, the foundation, who grew the food. Then the artisans, who made the useful things. And at the bottom the merchants, who merely moved things around. It was a perfect, divinely ordained structure. The most important rule in this structure was that only we, the samurai, were permitted to carry two swords. This right, the daisho, was not a privilege. It was the visible manifestation of our soul, the bedrock of our authority. To be a samurai was to be a man of violence, a specialist in a craft forbidden to others. To be a peasant was to be a man of the earth, to live and die by the rhythm of the seasons. Your hands calloused by the hoe, not the hilt of a sword. You bowed when we passed. You did not look us in the eye. You certainly did not entertain the notion of wielding a weapon. This was not just law, it was the natural order of the universe. It was a neat and tidy arrangement that kept everyone in their proper place, mostly ours, at the top. The idea of arming a farmer was not just illegal, it was profoundly laughable. What would he do? Threaten the enemy with a sharply worded complaint about the price of radishes? The first man to truly entertain this laughable idea was a brilliant, consumptive, and utterly mad samurai from Choshu named Takasugi Shinsaku. Faced with the need to build a modern army to fight the shogunate, and with not enough samurai to fill its ranks, he committed an act of radical heresy. He created the Kiheitai, the irregular unit, and he opened its ranks to anyone with a pulse and a grievance, regardless of class. He armed peasants, merchants, and even monks with modern rifles, and trained them to fight as a cohesive unit. The initial reaction from the samurai establishment, my own class, was a predictable mixture of outrage and scorn. Arming the lower classes. It was an affront to our ancestors, a violation of sacred tradition. It was like teaching a carp to fly. Most of us assumed this peasant army would break and scatter at the first sound of a real battle. We were fools. We had forgotten a simple truth. A man who has been downtrodden his entire life, when given a weapon and a cause, fights with a fury that a privileged man can scarcely comprehend. Support our shifting social order. Subscribe now. The pragmatic reasons for this shocking development were, of course, undeniable. The Boshin War was a numbers game, and there were simply not enough of us to go around. A samurai is an expensive creature to maintain. He requires a stipend, armor, attendance, and years of training. A peasant conscript, on the other hand, is wonderfully cheap. You give him a rifle, a handful of ammunition, a few weeks of drill, and point him at the enemy.
From a purely economic standpoint, a standpoint which our new leaders were distressingly fond of, it was a sound investment. Warfare by accounting had arrived. The sight of it was something I will never forget. Men whose hands were shaped by the soil, whose backs were bent from a lifetime of planting rice, were now learning to stand upright, to load a cartridge, to take a life from 100 paces. At first, they were clumsy. They lacked our martial grace, our innate understanding of balance and movement. They held their rifles awkwardly, as if they were strange and dangerous farm implements. But they learned. They learned because their survival depended on it, and fear is a remarkable teacher. A samurai must understand strategy, philosophy, the eightfold path of swordsmanship, the subtle psychology of a duel. A peasant rifleman needs only to understand one thing: point this end toward the enemy and pull the trigger when commanded. It turns out to be a remarkably simple lesson, with a distressingly high rate of success. Their lack of formal martial training was, in a strange way, an advantage. They had no bad habits to unlearn, no honorable but suicidal instincts to suppress. They simply did as they were told, firing in disciplined volleys that tore our traditional units to shreds. And they had a different kind of motivation. We samurai fought for our lord, for our domain, for the abstract concept of honor. A peasant in the Kihei-tai fought for something far more tangible. He fought for a future where his son might not have to bow and scrape. He fought for the respect that had been denied him his entire life. He fought to prove that he, a man of the dirt, was the equal of the men who had ruled over him for centuries. This personal, bitter motivation gave them a grim tenacity that was deeply unsettling to face. This, then, was the true terror of the farmer with a rifle. He destroyed the social order without laying a hand on it. How can you maintain your divinely ordained superiority over a man who carries the same weapon as you, fights in the same trench beside you, and can kill you just as dead as you can kill him? The battlefield became the great equalizer, the ultimate solvent of class distinctions. The carefully constructed pyramid of our society was being flattened by the rifle butt. I remember a skirmish in the north. Our unit, a traditional samurai host, was pinned down by rifle fire. We could not advance. Our commander, a proud man of impeccable lineage, was at a loss. It was a young farmer's son in his company, a boy who had been conscripted only months before, who noticed a weakness in the enemy's flank. He had a hunter's eye for terrain. Our commander, after a moment of visible, agonizing hesitation, took the boy's advice. We followed the peasant's plan, and we won the day. After the battle, the commander, a man who would not normally have acknowledged the boy's existence, had to thank him. The world tilted on its axis in that moment. The shogunate, to its credit and to its detriment, was far more reluctant to embrace this new reality. As the ruling power, it was the primary beneficiary of the old class system. To arm the peasants would be to saw off the branch upon which they sat. They put their faith in their samurai vassals and their elite, French-trained but still samurai-led modern units. Their armies were often larger, but they were hampered by their own traditions. They could not bring themselves to fully unleash the power of the common man, and this hesitation was a fatal weakness. They wanted to win the war without breaking the very rules that the war was making obsolete. On the other hand, the imperial forces had no such qualms. The leaders of Satsuma and Choshu were pragmatists. They saw the common people not as a foundation to be kept in place, but as a weapon to be wielded. They promised reform, a more egalitarian society, a nation where talent, not birth, would determine a man's worth. Of course, this was mostly propaganda to fill the ranks of their armies, but it was incredibly effective propaganda. It gave the commoner a stake in the outcome of the war, something he had never had before. The experience of fighting alongside these commoner soldiers was a constant lesson in humility. They complained more than samurai, had cruder manners, and their understanding of poetry was, without exception, abysmal. But they were tough. They could endure hardships with a stoicism born from a lifetime of it. They were practical. They saw no dishonor in digging a trench or retreating when outgunned. They simply wanted to survive, and their peasant cunning was often more useful than a samurai's rigid code of honor. We had always believed that our martial spirit, our Yamato Damashi, was a unique quality of our class. We believed that only a samurai, through years of discipline and spiritual training, could possess the true heart of a warrior. The Boshin War proved this to be a comforting and entirely arrogant lie. The heart of a warrior, it turns out, can beat just as strongly in the chest of a fisherman or a carpenter, especially when you put a rifle in his hands and promise him a better life. This armed peasantry was the true revolution. The political squabbles between the shogunate and the imperial court were just a power struggle between elites. The real, fundamental change was happening on the ground, where the clear lines between the ruler and the ruled were being washed away in blood and gunpowder. The sword had been the symbol of our class's power. The rifle became the symbol of its destruction. As the war progressed, the change.
Our beautiful city, once tranquil, now it smells of gunpowder and cheap tobacco. And horses, but that's always been the case. Still, progress, they say. It's losing its ancient discipline, its very soul. Edo was once a city of wood and paper, of silent canals and the gentle clip-clop of sandals on a wooden bridge. It was the shogun's city, a sprawling necropolis that ran on the quiet, efficient engine of tradition. It had a rhythm, a predictable and comforting pulse. The toll of temple bells in the morning, the chatter of merchants in Nihonbashi, the rustle of silk in the samurai quarters of Yamanote. It was a city of order. The air itself had a familiar scent. It smelled of wood smoke from a million kitchen hearths, of fragrant incense drifting from temple gates, of the salt air from the bay, and the rich aroma of street food, grilled eel and hot soba noodles. Every district had its own character, its own unique perfume. You could navigate the city with your eyes closed, guided by the familiar landscape of sounds and smells. It was our city. It was vast, it was crowded, but it was ours, and it made sense. Now, Edo is a city of confusion. The old rhythms are being drowned out by a new, discordant noise. The old smells are being overwhelmed by strange and often offensive new odors. The foreigners and the Japanese who foolishly imitate them have brought their world with them, and they are spilling it all over our clean, ordered streets. They call this transformation progress. I call it a disease of the spirit, a creeping plague that is infecting the heart of our nation, starting with its great capital. The first sign of the sickness was the people themselves. After the port of Yokohama was forced open, the barbarians began to venture into Edo. Seeing one for the first time was a shock. They are so large, so ungainly. They walk with a heavy, clumsy stride, as if they are at war with the ground beneath their feet. Their clothes are bizarre constructions of dark, heavy wool, even in the summer. And their faces, covered in hair of unnatural colors, red and yellow, like overgrown moss. They speak in loud, booming voices, laughing at things no sane person would find amusing. They are an affront to the eye and the ear. If you're enjoying this culture clash, please subscribe for more. Then came the smells. A city's soul is in its scent, and our soul is being suffocated. A new smell now hangs in the air, a greasy, acrid smell of coal smoke from their steamships and the few ugly factories that have begun to sprout like iron weeds. There is the scent of foreign cooking, of roasting meat, beef and pork, animals we considered unclean. And there is the cloying, sweet stench of their cheap tobacco and cigars, a smell that clings to everything and everyone. The clean scent of wood smoke has been replaced by the foul breath of industry. The sounds have changed too. The gentle rhythm of wooden clogs on dirt paths is being replaced by the harsh clatter of iron-shod hooves and steel-rimmed carriage wheels on newly paved stone streets. The steam whistle from the harbor cuts through the morning air, a shriek that sets a dog's teeth on edge. And they have brought their music, if you can call it that. Brass bands, full of trumpets and drums, that play loud marching tunes with no subtlety, no sense of the elegant silence between notes. It is the sound of an ère, not a culture. The very face of the city is beginning to scar and pucker. For centuries, our buildings were of wood, cypress, and cedar, designed to live in harmony with the earth, to sway with the tremor, to be rebuilt with grace. They are now erecting buildings of brick and stone. These structures are monstrous. They are heavy, square, arrogant things that do not rest upon the land, but crush it. They build as if they are making tombs or fortresses, with thick walls and small windows, defying the sun and air. The foreign legations look like prisons, and our own new government buildings are beginning to imitate them. A new district, the Ginza, was recently destroyed by a fire. The government has decided to rebuild it in the Western style, a model of modernization. They speak of brick buildings, gas lamps, and wide, straight streets. They want to turn a beloved part of our city into a foreign town. They are erasing our memories, paving over our past with brick and stone, and calling it an improvement. Soon a man will not be able to get properly lost in the winding, familiar alleys of his own city. And the fashions, this may be the most painful transformation of all. Ambitious men seeking favor with the new government have begun to adopt Western dress. They saw off their top-knots, that proud symbol of the samurai, and slicked their hair with foul-smelling grease. They squeeze themselves into tight woolen trousers and restrictive jackets. A samurai in a suit looks like a confused badger that has been forced into a waistcoat. It is a hideous look. They top this absurdity with a hard, black pot on their head called a bowler hat. It is hideous. Their wives are beginning to follow suit, abandoning the beautiful flowing kimono for strange restrictive contraptions involving corsets and bustles, making them look like trussed-up birds. They attend balls, a bizarre ritual where men and women hold each other in public and spin around in circles until they are dizzy. They call this dancing. I call it a public disgrace and an excellent opportunity for a pickpocket. The simple grace of our own culture is being traded for a clumsy, vulgar imitation of the West. New tastes and new vices are arriving daily. Shops have opened selling Western goods, bitter coffee, cloyingly sweet cakes and beer, a fizzy, unpleasant drink that tastes of fermented bread. Restaurants have appeared serving gyunabe, a beef hot pot. The idea of eating beef, a creature that works in our fields, was once unthinkable. Now it is considered fashionable, a sign of being modern and enlightened. The men who eat it say it will make them strong like Westerners, I suspect it will only make them smell bad. The city is awakened by the clang of the streetcar, a metal box on wheels that moves without horses, pulled by some unseen force along iron rails laid in the street. It is noisy, dangerous, and tears up the roads. People flock to ride it as if it were a magical palanquin. They pay money to be jolted around and delivered to a place they could have easily walked to. This is the great wonder of the new age, finding more expensive and complicated ways to do simple things. Even our way of telling time is under assault. We have always lived by the rhythm of the sun, with floating hours that stretched in the summer and shrank in the winter. It was a human way of keeping time. The foreigners have brought their clocks, their rigid mechanical time of equal hours, minutes, and seconds. They want to put the entire nation on a schedule, to make us servants to the ticking of a machine. Our lives are to be measured not by the seasons, but by the timetable. The political changes have struck the deepest blow. In 1868, the young emperor left his ancient capital of Kyoto and moved into our city. He took over the shogun's castle, the very heart of Tokugawa power, and made it his own. And they changed the name. Our city, Edo, the door to the bay, was renamed. It is now to be called Tokyo, the eastern capital. It was the ultimate act of conquest, not with armies, but with a new name on a map. They stole our city and gave it a new identity. For a man like me, whose family served the Tokugawa for generations, this was an unbearable insult. To see the imperial banner flying over Edo Castle is a daily reminder of our defeat. The city now belongs to the men of Satsuma and Choshu, our bitter rivals. They walk the streets with an owner's arrogance, while we, the natives of this city, have become ghosts in our own home. The samurai quarters are emptying out, as warriors without masters can no longer afford to live there. The air itself is thick with uncertainty. The old hierarchies are gone. A man no longer knows his place. I saw a former daimyo, a great lord, being jostled in the street by a merchant who had grown rich selling guns. The merchant did not even apologize. 10 years ago, that merchant would have been cut down for such an insolence. Today,
Some of us still charged with swords. It's less effective, more symbolic, a very bloody, very definitive kind of symbolism. Our Bushido demands it, even when fate scoffs. The Boshin War was, for all practical purposes, lost when the shogun fled from Osaka and his capital at Edo surrendered without a fight. The mathematics of the conflict, the guns, the ships, the money, were settled. But a war is more than mathematics. It is also a thing of the spirit. And while the body of the shogunate was dead, its spirit refused to be vanquished so easily. It retreated to the cold, rugged north of Japan to make its last stand. What is a last stand? It is a conscious decision to choose a noble death over a compromised life. It is a declaration that even when victory is impossible, honor is not. For the men who fought on in the North, for the Northern Alliance, this was not a war to win power. That dream was gone. This was a war about how to lose. It was a struggle to write the final chapter of their story in their own blood, rather than have it written for them in the ink of a surrender document. As a man who chose to live, I must admit a certain grudging envy for their clarity. The soul of this doomed resistance was the Aizu domain. There is no other word for it. For centuries, Aizu had been the sword and shield of the Tokugawa clan.
Their loyalty was not a political calculation. It was a sacred, multi-generational trust. Their samurai were raised from birth on a code of absolute obedience and unshakable martial virtue. When the new Meiji government branded their lord, Matsudaira Katamori, an enemy of the court, it was not merely a political designation. It was an existential threat. For Aizu, surrender was not an option. It was unthinkable. So they prepared for a war of annihilation. The entire domain became an armed camp. It was not just the samurai who prepared to fight. Farmers sharpened bamboo spears. Merchants helped to cast makeshift cannons. And the women of Aizu, who were as steeped in the warrior code as their husbands and sons, prepared to defend their homes to the last. This was not a battle for a political cause. It was the defense of a way of life, the last stand of a family facing a tidal wave. Keep the valiant, if doomed, spirit alive. Like and subscribe. The Imperial Army, nearly 30,000 strong, confident and armed with the best modern weapons, marched into Aizu in the autumn of 1868. They expected a swift victory. They found a cornered tiger. The fighting was brutal, intimate, and desperate. Every pass, every valley, every bridge was contested. The Aizu samurai, though outgunned, fought with a ferocity that shocked the invaders. They would charge rifle lines with swords, emerging from the forests like vengeful spirits, seeking to close the distance where their true skill lay. And then there were the women. The story of Nakano Takeko and her small band of female warriors should be a lesson to us all. As the battle raged at the Yanagi Bridge, Takeko, armed with a long-bladed naginata, led a charge of her own, a unit of no more than 30 women, directly into the enemy's rifle fire. They fought with a fury that stunned the imperial troops. Takeko herself cut down 5 or 6 men before she was shot in the chest. Dying, she asked her sister to cut off her head and take it away so the enemy could not claim it as a trophy. She did so, and Takeko's head was spirited away to be buried with honor. Think of that. In an age where samurai were learning to duck and run, the women of Aizu had to show us how to die. Their charge was futile. They did not win the battle, but they won an immortality of the spirit. It was the most inspiring and the most shaming moment of the war. The main battle centered on the siege of Aizu Wakamatsu Castle, a formidable fortress where the last of the Aizu forces gathered. For a month, the castle withstood a relentless bombardment from the Imperial Army's modern artillery. The town around the castle was burned to the ground. Inside, samurai, their wives, and even their children patched the walls, tended the wounded, and returned fire with their own antiquated cannons, a gesture of defiance against the inevitable. It was during this siege that the most infamous tragedy of the war occurred. The story of the Byakuto Tai, the White Tiger Force. A unit of teenage samurai, boys aged 16 and 17, was fighting a desperate battle on the outskirts of the castle town. Cut off and forced to retreat to a nearby hill, they looked back upon their home. Through the smoke and flames, they saw what they believed to be the main castle keep, destroyed and burning. Their home was lost. Their lord was defeated. Overwhelmed by despair and bound by their strict code, they made a decision. They would not suffer the disgrace of capture. One by one, they committed ritual suicide, taking their own lives there on Moriyama Hill. But they were wrong. The smoke they saw was from the burning town, not the castle itself. The castle was still holding out.
They died for a mistake, victims of their own impossibly demanding code. Their story is held up as an example of loyalty. I see it as a heartbreaking indictment of the very Bushido that sent children to their deaths. Inside the castle, the situation grew more hopeless by the day. Food was running out. The walls were crumbling under the constant cannon fire. The defenders were exhausted, their numbers dwindling. The Lord of Aizu, Matsudaira Katamori, was faced with an impossible choice. Fight to the last man, woman, and child, ensuring the complete annihilation of his people, or surrender, saving their lives but sacrificing their honor. In the end, he chose to live. He chose the courage of the survivor over the glory of the martyr. After a month of brutal resistance, the gates of Aizu Wakamatsu opened, and the Lord surrendered. It was a quiet, solemn, and deeply courageous act of submission. The tiger of Aizu had finally been caged. The greatest symbol of samurai resistance was no more. The spirit of the North was broken. But it was not entirely extinguished. A final, desperate ember of the resistance still glowed. The remnants of the shogunate's navy, under Admiral Enomoto Takeaki, had fled to the northern island of Hokkaido. With them were a handful of French advisors, including the stubborn Captain Brunet and some of the most die-hard Tokugawa loyalists, men who simply could not accept defeat. There, on that wild frontier island, they embarked on one last, glorious act of absurdity. They founded a republic, the Ezo Republic. It was a fever dream, a political fantasy born of desperation. The most ardent defenders of feudalism founded a democracy. They held elections. They had a president. It was a grand, theatrical gesture of defiance, a final refusal to accept the reality that their world was over. After the deep, profound tragedy of Aizu, the war ended with the high farce of a samurai republic. Here, in the snowy fortress of Goryokaku in Hakodate, the last of the legends gathered for their final performance. The most notable among them was Hijikato Toshizo, the demon vice-commander of the feared Shinsengumi. The Shinsengumi had been the shogun's ruthless police force in Kyoto, hunters of rebels. Now, Hijikato was a general in a rebel republic. The ironies of this war were endless. Hijikato knew the Republic of Ezo was doomed. He fought not for victory, but for a good death, a worthy end for a man who had lived by the sword. He led his troops with his characteristic blend of brilliance and brutality. He was the living embodiment of the old samurai spirit, refusing to bend, refusing to break, seeking only a final violent union with his fate. The end came in the spring of 1869. The massive imperial army and navy arrived to crush the fledgling republic. The battle...
They say it's a restoration. Feels more like a demolition. My topknot is next, I hear. The shame. My Bushido tells me to resist, but what if resistance means only foolishness? The war is over. The last shots have been fired, the last swords sheathed. We have peace, but it is the sterile, unsettling peace of a graveyard, a quiet that comes after everything you know has been killed. The men who won the war, the ambitious samurai from Satsuma and Choshu, are now in charge. They speak of a new Japan, of enriching the country, strengthening the military. They call it the Meiji Restoration, a lovely, hopeful name. I call it the Great Unraveling.
They speak of restoring the emperor to a power he never truly possessed, and to do so they have destroyed a government that, for all its faults, kept the peace for 250 years. It is like restoring a beautiful old house by burning it to the ground and building a square, foreign-style hotel on the ashes. They say the old house was rotting from within. Perhaps it was, but I lived there. It was my home. Now I am a stranger in the new hotel, and they are demanding I pay for the room in a currency I do not possess. The new government began its work with a document called the Charter Oath, sworn by the young emperor in 1868. It was full of lofty, beautiful-sounding promises. Deliberative assemblies shall be established, all classes shall unite, knowledge shall be sought throughout the world, and my personal favorite, evil customs of the past shall be broken off. It did not take us long to figure out that the primary evil custom they had in mind was the entire existence of the samurai class. For the first few years, we were adrift, but intact. The war was over, but the structure of society remained. And then, in 1871, the first great hammer blow fell. The government issued an edict abolishing the domains. The Han, the feudal territories that had been our homes, our nations in miniature for centuries, were gone. Overnight, they were replaced by prefectures, administrative districts controlled by a central government in Tokyo. My lord was now a private citizen with a government pension. My home was now just a spot on a bureaucrat's map. My loyalty, the bedrock of my identity, had no object. If you're still processing this dizzying turn of events, be sure to subscribe. With the domains gone, the class system itself was next on the chopping block. The government officially abolished the four-tiered hierarchy of samurai, farmer, artisan, and merchant. We were all now, in theory, equal commoners under the emperor. They gave us a new name. We were no longer samurai. We were shizoku, former samurai. It is a polite, bureaucratic term that tastes like ash in the mouth. It means unemployed man with a noble history and no future. The farmers and merchants were now heimin, commoners, which they were before, but now they could look us in the eye while we were all starving together. This is progress. Then came the indignities, the small, deliberate cuts designed to bleed our spirit dry. They began to suggest that the samurai top-knot, the chonmage, was an outdated custom, unsuitable for a modern nation. Government officials started cutting theirs off, adopting Western hairstyles, slicked back with pomade. To see a man whose family had worn the topknot for 500 years suddenly appear with his hair cut short like a barbarian or a Buddhist priest, it was a jarring sight. It was a voluntary surrender of one's identity. My own topknot feels heavy these days. It marks me as a relic, a man of the past. Children sometimes point in the street. I am told that soon it may be mandated by law that we cut them. They will legislate our very scalps. I do not know what I will do. It is just hair, a rational man might say. But it is not. It is a statement. It is the last flag flying over a conquered castle. And they want me to pull it down myself. The most painful blow, the one that truly cut to the soul, came in 1876. It was the Haitore, the sword ban edict. With a stroke of a pen, the new government forbade the shizoku from wearing their swords in public. The daisho, the matched pair of long and short swords, was the exclusive right and the very soul of the samurai. It was what separated us from everyone else. It was the physical manifestation of our authority, our honor, our purpose, and they took it away. Only policemen and soldiers in the new national army are now permitted to wear swords. Our identity has become a government-issued uniform. To walk the streets unarmed, my left side feeling unnaturally light, is a constant, unending humiliation. I feel naked, neutered. My swords now sit in a corner of my small room, gathering dust. They are masterpieces of the smith's art, capable of cleaving steel. Now they are nothing more than quaint decorations, artifacts from a dead culture, my culture. And finally came the economic execution. For centuries, samurai had lived on hereditary stipends paid in rice by our daimyo. After the domains were abolished, the new central government reluctantly took over these payments. But we were a heavy burden, an entire class of pensioners. So they solved the problem. They converted our stipends into interest-bearing government bonds, payable over a period of years. It was a one-time payment to get us off the books. Most of us, having been taught our whole lives to despise money and commerce, had no idea what to do with these pieces of paper. We were warriors, not merchants. Many samurai sold their bonds for a fraction of their value for quick cash. They tried to start businesses, ventures for which they had no talent or training. They were swindled by clever merchants. Within a few years, much of the samurai class was destitute. We had gone from the ruling class to the new poor. So now we must work. We must learn a trade. I have seen proud men who once commanded hundreds of warriors, trying to learn how to make umbrellas or farm radishes. I have seen men whose names were once famous in the fencing halls of Edo, now pulling rickshaws, their faces hidden in shame under a wide hat. I myself tried to get a position as a clerk in a government office. They said my calligraphy was excellent, but my knowledge of arithmetic was lacking. A samurai does not count. He takes what is his due. A deeply flawed business model, it turns out. The government that has done this to us is a government of our kind. The men in charge in Tokyo, the great ministers, they are all shizoku, men from Satsuma, from Choshu. They were samurai, and they have systematically, deliberately, and efficiently destroyed the very class from which they sprang. It is a betrayal so profound, so complete, that it defies comprehension. It is as if the chief priests of a faith decided to burn down their own temple and sell the stones for ballast. They argue it is necessary. They say that to be strong, to resist the West, Japan must become a unified nation with a modern economy and a national army of conscripts. They say the samurai class with its feudal loyalties and its hereditary privileges was an obstacle to this future. To save Japan, the samurai had to die. Perhaps they are right. It is small comfort when you are the one being sacrificed on the altar of progress. This Meiji, this enlightened rule, feels very dark from where I am standing. I see the new telegraph wires being strung across the city, and I am told they are a miracle of communication. I see the new railways being built, and they say it will unify the country. But I see a web being spun, an iron cage being built, a cage of progress that has no room for men like me. We are ghosts now. We haunt the new Japan. We are a reminder of a past they are desperate to bury. We are the men with phantom swords at our
The signal is weakening. I can feel it. This voice, carried on whatever strange ether allows it to reach you, feels thinner now, more static than substance. It is an echo from a world that has already passed into memory, a ghost story told by the ghost himself. When I began this broadcast, I was a samurai in a land of samurai. Now I am a museum piece that has forgotten its place behind the glass. We have reached the end of the scroll. Do you remember how it began? In the long, quiet dream of the Tokugawa peace? We were a nation perfected, polished, and sealed away from the grubby hands of the outside world. Our greatest anxieties were the composition of a 17-syllable poem or the correct way to fold a kimono. We were so beautifully, perfectly bored. We were a pristine porcelain vase sitting on a lacquered shelf, blissfully unaware that the shelf itself was being devoured by the termites of time. It was a good life, if you didn't mind the crushing lack of purpose. Then came the smoke on the water. Our long, quiet dream was shattered by the shriek of a steam whistle. The barbarians did not knock politely on the door. They took a cannon to it and demanded we admire their sales catalogue of modern weaponry. And we, in our infinite wisdom, spent a great deal of time arguing about the proper way to sweep up the splinters. Our world of subtle hints and unspoken rules was confronted by the loud, vulgar certainty of the gunboat. It was a conversation we were destined to lose. And so we turned on each other, the Boshin War, the great tragedy. We took up our swords and our new foreign-made rifles, and we pointed them at our brothers. We fought for loyalty, but our loyalties were confused. We fought for honor, but our honor became situational. In the end, we fought because fighting was the only thing we had left to do. It was the death rattle of our class, a final convulsive spasm before the stillness set in. We proved to our new masters that we were too dangerous to keep and too expensive to feed. After the chaos of war came the quiet, organized cruelty of peace. The Meiji government, the very men who had once screamed, "Expel the Barbarian," now set about turning Japan into a frantic imitation of the West. They dismantled our world with the detached efficiency of a butcher taking apart a carcass. An edict that took away our domains, our lords, our very reason for being. An edict that took our stipends, our livelihood. And finally, the cruelest cut of all, an edict that took our swords. A bullet only takes your life. The Haitore took our soul. I now walk through a city I no longer recognize. Edo is gone, replaced by a restless, ambitious creature called Tokyo. The air buzzes with the clicking of telegraphs and the rumbling of machines. Men who once wore their top knots with pride now have their hair shorn like Westerners and discuss interest rates. Women who once practiced the tea ceremony now learn to waltz. It is a world of bewildering contradictions, a place where you can see a man in a bowler hat bowing to a man in a temple. It is vibrant and alive, I suppose, but it is not mine. So why have I sent out this broadcast? Why speak into the void from a world that has already a memory? Because an echo is better than silence. Because a story, even a sad and absurd one, is better than being forgotten. My purpose was not to win you to my lost cause, but to make you a witness to it, to have you understand that progress is never clean. It is always bought with a price, paid for by those who are left behind. We, the samurai, were the price of modern Japan. I have told you of our discipline, our folly, our honor, and our end. I have shown you the beauty of our isolation and the madness of our collapse. Now my voice grows tired. The static is rising like a tide to claim this last signal. The sun is setting on my world, but it is rising on yours. What you do with that light is up to you. Just do not forget the shadows that it casts. And so, as the sun rises on a Japan that no longer recognizes itself, this has been Master Kenji, your humble and increasingly anachronistic broadcaster from the final days of the shogunate. We saw Bushido challenged, felt the sting of gunfire, and witnessed the Emperor's return. And what a busy return it's been. If this desperate, darkly humorous transmission from the brink of a new era has given you a moment of profound contemplation, or perhaps made you appreciate your own era's stable plumbing and lack of mandatory top-knot removal, then my purpose is served. Keep listening. Keep questioning, and, for the sake of the ancient discipline that once guided us, keep that subscribe button pressed, because even when tradition gives way to gunpowder, the spirit of inquiry remains. Until the next broadcast, from somewhere less prone to beheadings, sayonara.